Each and every one of you have been infected with a virus. It spreads rapidly, going past our campus, infecting the United States, maybe infecting the entire world. Infants are infected at birth, and by the time they are 2, they start to reflect the impact of the virus on their brain. And by the time they are 5, their daily functioning, their behavior, and their decisions reflect the impact of this virus on their brains and on their psyche. And despite the fact that scientists have been studying this virus for over 50 years, there is still no cure. I imagine that hearing this, some of you are wondering, well, when is the cure coming? How long do we have to wait? Maybe you're even angry that this information is not more widely known. The virus I'm referring to is called implicit bias. Most of us are familiar with explicit bias. This is that old-fashioned, obvious racism, sexism, where people consciously hold beliefs about different groups of people and they act on those beliefs. Implicit bias is different. It's more difficult to see because implicit bias sits outside of our conscious awareness, and it influences what we think and feel and reflects those beliefs that we have about other groups of people. Implicit bias sneaks into our brains, infects our psyche, and determines how we will think, feel, and behave without us having any awareness that it's doing this. And finally, implicit bias is universal. None of us are immune, and all of us have been infected. When we think about implicit bias, part of what we know is that it is impacting us, and it's doing this before we even are aware of its existence. But thankfully, we know that explicit bias, that old-fashioned racism and sexism, that's been steadily decreasing over the past 50 years. Unfortunately, implicit bias has been steadily increasing during that same period of time. And implicit bias is far more dangerous and insidious because it impacts who we are and who we will become without ever having awareness that it even exists. In fact, preschoolers are aware of the race and gender hierarchies that we adults often believe that we've hidden from them. Now, this adorable baby is now 15, and he has given me permission to share this story with you. When Cameron was 3 years old, he brought this DVD case to me, and on it there were dark hand and a light hand intertwined. Cameron touched the dark hand, not too dissimilar from his own, and he asked, "Is this a bad movie, Mommy? Is this a bad movie, Mommy?" He had already learned that dark skin equals bad, but he was only 3 years old. Now, to give you some context, our family is vigilant about protecting our children from negative messages regarding skin color and race. Not only is our family a beautiful mosaic of all of the various tones that people can come in, but we are diligent about combating those negative messages with everything from the books that we read to the artwork on our walls. So, how does this happen in our house? It happens in our home because it happens to each and every one of us. This is how a 3-year-old learns that dark skin equals bad. And this is how we all learn implicit bias. You see, implicit bias is not actually a malicious or even a pathological process. It's actually just a byproduct of a very normal brain function. Our brains have to simplify the processing of over 11 million pieces of data every single moment of every single day. So when information is linked together multiple times, our brains take over, and it begins to automatically pair that for us so that we don't have to even think about it. So we learn things like dark-skinned equals bad. Now, this is part of an automatic process. So if I were to say something like apples and, thank you, then most of you think apples and oranges. And I'm willing to bet that none of you thought apples and tangerines. I think that was my 5-year-old. The problem with this process is only when we use it to begin sorting other human beings. In this process, we all develop implicit bias. And we can develop these contradictory beliefs that we think we believe one thing about a group of people, and our implicit bias reveals that we think another. And when we do this, it makes us incredibly uncomfortable. And what do we do when we're uncomfortable? We avoid the topic, we avoid the people that bring it up, we deny its existence, and we minimize its importance to our personal lives. So I'm going to ask you to hang in there with me. Even if you are uncomfortable, even if you think what I'm saying does not apply to you. But how is it that we have all developed implicit bias? Well, as one example, we receive dozens of messages that give us images and thoughts and beliefs about certain kinds of people being more nurturing and certain kinds of people being more strong. In fact, we are inundated with dozens, if not hundreds, of messages that pair groups of people with a variety of characteristics: intelligent, kind, nurturing, hardworking, dangerous. This is very much like standing in the center of the rain. I might get a couple of drops, someone else may get soaked, but no matter what you do, if you stand in the rain, you get wet. Well, these hundreds of messages that we receive about other groups of people are very much the same as standing in the rain. And we could no more hope to emerge from this deluge without bias than we could hope to stand in the center of that storm and not get wet. And for this reason, we all need a renewed commitment to addressing implicit bias. And not because it's a good thing to do or a charitable thing to do for those marginalized people over there, but because we all pay a price for implicit bias, whether we are marginalized or whether we are privileged. Individually, we pay a price for implicit bias with our basic humanity, with our ability to feel empathy for others, and with our ability to form genuine human connections with one another. Organizations that allow bias to proliferate lose millions of dollars every single year. And this is lost because of less creative and innovative product designs. It's lost in customers that don't buy. It's in employee lowered productivity and employees that eventually leave the organization altogether. And our educational centers pay a high price for the bias that exists within our ivory tower. This is not only because of the lost tuition when students leave, but it's also in our tarnished reputations that discourage diverse students and faculty from bringing their talents to our institutions. And finally, there is a price that is paid for the students that remain. We know that diversity and teaching competence across difference leads to academic excellence. Students that are raised and are educated in diverse classrooms are superior communicators. They are more creative. They are better problem solvers. And they are more effective leaders. But implicit bias in the daily experiences of diverse students and faculty diminishes their full participation in those very same settings. As a result, it diminishes the benefits that are experienced by all students. But again, there's good news. We can do something to change our implicit bias. We can do something to change the likelihood that we will act on the biases that we all harbor. First, we must bravely face our own biases. Take responsibility for learning what they are and for bringing them into our conscious awareness. I admit, this is a frightening thing for most of us to do. It's a frightening thing for me to do. But we can't treat a virus if we don't even know what virus we're fighting. And we must boldly and continuously challenge those biases that we find within ourselves. We do this by asking difficult questions. What evidence do I have that supports this belief I have is true? Even more important, what evidence do I have that suggests that this belief is false? And we challenge our beliefs by forming genuine connections with one another, with people that we think are different from us. As we form these connections, we come to find similarities between us and them that remind us that we are all far more similar than we are different. And we need to courageously live as ambassadors for change. Going to other people and asking them to have those difficult questions. What are the biases that they have, and how do those biases impact their behavior? Now, I admit, that is probably the most frightening thing I've been saying all night. But having those difficult conversations gets easier. We get better at it. We become more comfortable doing them, and we become more effective when we have those conversations and we keep the conversations going. But all of those strategies are individual strategies. And we cannot forget that bias is also systemic and it is structural. So we have to demand more from our institutions. Our colleges and universities have a unique obligation to teach students about bias because we are shaping future generations. So it is incumbent upon us to educate students not only about bias, but also how to have those difficult conversations about structures that allow bias to proliferate. Oppression, structural oppression, discrimination, and our own personal responsibility for their continued existence. If we're willing to do these things, if we are willing to bravely face our own bias, to boldly and consistently confront the biases we find ourselves, and to courageously live as ambassadors for this powerful social change, we will have the power to transform our world. Thank you.